State University. He is an associate professor of religious studies and an adjunct professor of law. He's also the director of their Muslim studies program. There's a little more of his bio before we return to his hometown of East Lansing. He's homegrown Michigander, sorry. He was assistant professor of religion and visiting professor of law at the University of Illinois. His specialties are Islamic thought. He's the author of lots of stuff. Islam and the Fate of Others, A Salvation Question in 2012. Jihad, Radicalism, and the New Atheism, Cambridge Press, 2018. And also he's the editor of Between Heaven and Hell, Islam, Salvation, and the Fate of Others. He's also presented many papers and been part of conferences, and his presentation today sounds like the title of the book, right?
It is.
Jihad, Radicalism, and the New Atheism. Please help me welcome Professor Khalil.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you to the organizers, Professor Naveen Nusiri, Professor Asifa Qureshi-Landis, all the organizers. Thank you for welcoming a Spartan in your midst. It's my first time in the state of Wisconsin. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have to warn you, this is a dark subject. I'm sorry. Okay. In the midst of a lively televised exchange between oh, and I have to apologize, the microphone's not working, so I'll try to project. If you can't hear me, just let me know. Okay. In the midst of a lively televised exchange between journalist Fareed Zakaria, or Zakaria, as it's pronounced on CNN, and neuroscientist Sam Harris on the topic of jihad, Zakaria declared, "The problem is, you and Osama bin Laden agree. After all, you're saying his interpretation of Islam is correct." "Well," Harris responded, "his interpretation, this is the problem. His interpretation of Islam is very straightforward and honest, and you really have to split hairs and do some interpretive acrobatics in order to get it to look non-canonical." This exchange took place a little more than 13 years after the September 11, 2001 attacks. In the years following the 9/11 tragedy, various individuals known as New Atheists have produced influential anti-theistic and anti-religious works. Much of the focus of these works has been on Islam, and perhaps needless to say, the New Atheists represent only themselves and not atheists more generally. Some New Atheist writers were themselves profoundly transformed by 9/11. In the case of the prominent ex-Muslim writer Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for instance, her doubts about Islam were supplanted by non-belief when she found it, as she puts it, impossible to discount bin Laden's claims that the murderous destruction of innocent lives is consistent with the Quran. As for Harris, he reportedly began writing his landmark book, The End of Faith, on September 12, 2001. In this New York Times bestseller, Harris writes that the feature of Islam most troubling to non-Muslims is the very principle bin Laden invoked to justify 9/11, jihad. And as the English evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins would have it, it was belief in the literal truth of the Quran that led 19 well-educated middle-class men to kill thousands of people in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania. In this presentation, I intend to scrutinize some especially influential New Atheist claims regarding violence in Islam. Now, some might ask, why talk about the New Atheists in the age of Trump? Why talk about them at all? Isn't this giving them undue attention? Well, I've chosen to focus on the New Atheists largely because of their unique and ostensibly significant influence on Western, and to some extent non-Western, intellectual discourse. Having taught in the humanities at 2 public research universities in the American Midwest, both Big Ten schools, I have found that many of my own colleagues and students have been and continue to be more profoundly impacted by the writings of New Atheists than, say, polemical works by far-right religiously affiliated critics of Islam, whose impact is more obvious in other contexts. As such, I don't think it makes much sense to ignore the New Atheists. I discussed some of their claims and arguments in my most recent book, Jihad, Radicalism, and the New Atheism. And yes, this is a shameless plug. Now, I must say, this was a dark project, quite unlike my first book on salvation and divine mercy. In any case, this afternoon, I'd like to focus on the New Atheist claim that Muslim terrorism can be best explained by Islamic scripture. And of course, this claim is not unique to the New Atheists. And in the brief time I have, I'd like to pay special attention to the ever-influential writings of Sam Harris. Though critical of all monotheistic traditions, Harris has much to say about what he calls the problem with Islam, the title of one of the chapters of The End of Faith. Indeed, from the very beginning of this book, Harris casts a light on this particular problem. Harris opens The End of Faith in dramatic fashion, depicting a scene in which a suicide bomber detonates himself in a crowded bus. Harris tells us that the bomber's parents are sad when they hear the news, but they also feel tremendous pride because they know he has gone to heaven and has sent his victims to hell for eternity. It is a double victory. Assuming we know nothing else about the bomber, such as his past economic status, intelligence, educational background, or profession, Harris rhetorically asks, why is it so easy, so trivially easy, you could almost bet your life on it easy, to guess the young man's religion? Harris's point here is clear. Religious beliefs, in this case Islamic ones, can be dangerous. And I'll come back to this point. Inspired as he was by 9/11 to compose The End of Faith, Harris has much to say about the problem of Muslim suicide terrorism. As he presents it, it is Islamic ideology that best explains this phenomenon. After all, Harris notes, Muslim terrorists define themselves in religious terms. Of course, the same is true for many of their Muslim opponents, a significantly larger group. But for Harris, the exception often proves the rule. And in his efforts to cast Islamic doctrines of jihad and martyrdom as a sufficient explanation for Muslim terrorism, he highlights the case of a so-called failed Palestinian suicide bomber named Zaidan Zaidan. The latter, Harris writes, described being pushed to attack Israelis by the love of martyrdom. He, Zaidan, added, I didn't want revenge for anything. I just wanted to be a martyr. Mr. Zaidan, the would-be martyr, conceded that his Jewish captors were better than many, many Arabs. With regard to the suffering that his death would have inflicted upon his family, he reminded his interviewer that a martyr gets to pick 70 people to join him in paradise. He would have been sure to invite his family along. That Harris thought Zaidan's story was revealing and representative of a broader phenomenon of faith leading directly to destruction is suggested by the fact that this quoted passage appears in the introductory chapter of The End of Faith. Harris does not tell us anything else about Zaidan, but it is in fact more to his story. When quoting and discussing Zaidan, Harris cites a June 8, 2002 New York Times article. A close reading of this article reveals another side to the would-be suicide bomber. To quote the article, Zaidan, a fifth-grade dropout who can read but not write, became a carpenter, then a peddler of newspapers and other products in Israel. When the latest conflict began in September 2000, he said he sought work fruitlessly in Jenin, settling for a couple of hours spent each day carrying boxes of vegetables in the market there. The rest of the day he spent sleeping or hanging around a pool hall, smoking. And he happened to watch a religious lesson on television that convinced him he was wasting his time. And what he called his life's turning point, he quit billiards and began going to the mosque regularly. Eventually, he stopped smoking. He insisted that he was drawn to martyrdom by what he read in books, not by anything he heard from his imam. After Israel first raided Jenin's refugee camp at the beginning of March, Mr. Zaidan said he began to think seriously about becoming a suicide bomber. With regard to his planned attack, he insisted that he had sought to kill only soldiers whom he described as overwhelming adversaries. The author of this article, James Bennett, informs us that his 2+ hour conversation with Zaidan, then 18 years old, took place in an Israeli hospital shortly after the failed attack, while Zaidan was expecting to be prosecuted. guarded by 2 Israeli police officers, and manacled by a wrist and an ankle to his bed, he said bitterly that he knew he would be jailed for life and remembered only as a terrorist. I feel sorry because it was a mistake, he said, but as a human being, I should live like others. The way there is an Israeli state, there are people living in this state, enjoying life, having someone protect them. I don't live in this situation. I don't feel I'm secure. Soldiers could enter Jenin at any time, he said, and he constantly feared being arrested. As long as life continues like this, he said, you will have people who think like me. He insisted that he wanted peace, but said he saw little chance for it. Now, assuming Zaidan genuinely sought martyrdom, it is difficult to overlook the obvious political dimensions of his actions, his challenging life experiences, his limited education, and the circumstances of his conversation with Bennett, the author of the article, with Israeli officers nearby and a trial looming. Incidentally, Bennett, the author of the article, himself calls into question Zaidan's trustworthiness. Zaidan, he writes, insisted today that he had not detonated his bombs, but instead had been shot twice in the stomach by soldiers. This account was not supported by his wounds, according to the hospital. These are all not just details. Remember, all Harris tells us about Zaidan's motivation to attack Israelis is that he was driven by a love of martyrdom. Furthermore, Harris never conveys Zaidan's criticisms of the Israeli army. Instead, Harris simply tells us that Zaidan conceded that his Jewish captors were better than many, many Arabs. This is a remarkable example of cherry picking. And we see something similar in Harris's treatment of Islamic scripture, as he cites various translated Quranic passages without giving due consideration to their respective contexts, the surrounding passages, and other more precise translations. And here, I think an effective antidote would be Professor Asma Afsaruddin's book, Striving in the Path of God. Here, Professor Afsaruddin examines various Quranic passages on jihad and warfare and reveals the various ways that Muslim commentators have interpreted such passages. When talking about jihad, Harris's sources are limited, as he relies heavily on the late Bernard Lewis. And I'll say more about Professor Lewis in just a moment. Muslim scholarly sources are noticeably absent from Harris's bibliography. And this might explain the following passage from The End of Faith. Harris writes, surely there are Muslim jurists who might say that suicide bombing is contrary to the tenets of Islam. Where are these jurists, by the way? And that suicide bombers are therefore not martyrs, but fresh denizens of hell. Such a minority opinion, if it exists, cannot change the fact that suicide bombings have been rationalized by much of the Muslim world. Of course, the reality is that when Harris was writing this, multitudes, not all of course, but multitudes of prominent clerics and scholars had publicly, explicitly, and unequivocally condemned suicide missions and terrorism more broadly. At one point, Harris remarks, one can only marvel that suicide bombing is not more widespread. With his focus firmly on Muslim terrorism, Harris neglects the broader Islamic landscape. He was apparently unaware, for instance, that suicide attacks of any kind were historically uncommon in the Sunni tradition claimed by Sunni terrorists. And here we can also say the same for Twelver Shiites. Interestingly, the very authority Harris relies on when discussing jihad, Professor Bernard Lewis, who was hardly an apologist for Islam, had this to say in a 2009 co-authored work. The emergence of the by now widespread terrorism practice of suicide bombing is a development of the 20th century. It has no antecedents in Islamic history and no justification in terms of Islamic theology, law, or tradition. It is a pity that those who practice this form of terrorism are not better acquainted with their own religion and with the culture that grew up under the auspices of that religion. Recall that Harris opens The End of Faith by depicting a suicide bomber and then asking the reader why it's so easy to guess his religion. But Harris never grapples with the fact that before the early 1980s, there was no such thing as a Muslim suicide bomber. And even after that, the tactic of suicide bombing was never once employed in a conflict as intense as the Soviet-Afghan War, a war, incidentally, that involved so-called mujahideen, people who do jihad, and foreign fighters like a guy named bin Laden. Nevertheless, as Harris would have it, Muslims have not found anything of substance to say against the actions of the September 11 hijackers. This, of course, is an unfortunate myth. The reality is that the targeting of innocents, to say nothing of the method of attack, was a recurring theme in the September 2001 condemnations issued by countless scholars and clerics. But not only does Harris seem aloof to the major currents of Islamic thought, he also fails to maintain a consistent line of reasoning. Twice in The End of Faith, Harris contrasts Islam with the pacifist Jain religion. First he states, "There's a reason we must now confront Muslim rather than Jain terrorists in every corner of the world." For Harris, the reason is simply the nature of the Islamic tradition. Now, to place this statement in perspective, the entire Jain population amounts to no more than 0.5% of the entire worldwide Muslim population and is mostly concentrated in India. In any case, second, Harris asserts that in contrast with Islamic fundamentalism, a rise of Jain fundamentalism would endanger no one, because observant Jains will generally will not kill anything, including insects. And yet, just a few pages earlier, and in the context of defending the use of military technology, Harris describes pacifism as a deeply immoral position that comes to us swaddled in the dogma of highest moralism. It allows a variety of monsters currently loose in the world to threaten the rest of us. Then shortly after defending the limited use of torture when dealing with terrorists, he elaborates on the false choice of pacifism and explains why we must accept the fact that violence or its threat is often an ethical necessity. Thus, Harris's conception of legitimate violence actually overlaps to a large extent with that of many Muslims, and it actually seems to exceed the views of many other Muslims. But let's get back to Harris's main argument. As he sees it, what makes Muslim extremists extreme is their devotion to the literal word of the Quran and the Hadith. Violent radicals, we are led to believe, are monsters precisely because of their close adherence to the letter of Scripture. This is a point Harris makes in various writings, including The End of Faith, and more recently, his 2015 co-authored book, Islam and the Future of Tolerance. And there's actually now a documentary based on this film. Based on this book, excuse me. Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Richard Dawkins make similar claims in their respective works. In her 2015 book, Heretic, Ali remarks that since 9/11, she has been making a simple argument in response to Muslim terrorism. It is foolish to insist, as our leaders habitually do, that the violent acts of radical Islamists can be divorced from the religious ideals that inspire them. Thus, those who maintain that Muslim terrorism is actually a problem of poverty, insufficient education, or any other social precondition are offering, as she puts it, facile explanations. This is because Islamic violence is rooted in the foundational texts of Islam itself. Dawkins makes similar claims in his 2006 New York Times bestseller, The God Delusion. But in blaming Islam's foundational texts for contemporary terrorism, while downplaying other factors, Harris, Ali, and Dawkins present explanations that are just as facile as those of the apologists they criticize. In evaluating the claim that Muslim terrorism can be best explained by scriptural literalism, let us consider two case studies. The first is the justifications for terrorism presented in a 2017 ISIS publication. The second is bin Laden's justifications for the killing of innocents on 9/11. Now, there's a lot to say about ISIS, but in the interest of time, I'd like to focus on a single article that appeared in the January 2017 issue of the online ISIS magazine Rumiyya. By the way, I had to access this through an academic website, or else I wouldn't be here today. The article, entitled "Collateral Carnage," presents a justification for terrorism against its enemies and the killing of innocents. According to this anonymous article, although Muslims may not exclusively target non-threatening, non-Muslim women and children, such innocents may be generally attacked nonetheless if they are not distinctly isolated or easily distinguishable from enemy non-Muslim men. And according to this particular article, all such men would be considered combatants. Now, I told you this was a dark project. Imagine in preparing, writing this book, it's 2 in the morning and I'm looking at these documents. This was a depressing project, I have to say. But anyway, so again, they're saying that all enemy non-Muslim men are to be treated as combatants. This, by the way, contradicts the May 2017 issue of the same magazine, of Rumiyya, which notes that some categories of men are not to be treated as combatants. So we have a contradiction within just a few months, and this just goes to show how sloppy these ISIS documents are. In any case, to justify the collateral killing of innocent women and children, the ISIS author points to 2 reported prophetic precedents. One is the prophet permitting the use of mangonels. The author uses the broader term catapults, which the author claims were common in siege warfare, even during the life of the prophet. The Rumiyya author's assumption is that the prophet used a weapon of mass destruction that led to the deaths of innocents. But a careful examination of the various authoritative hadith collections and biographies of the prophet seems to undermine this assumption. Some biographies do not bother to mention the use of mangonels at all. Others mention it in passing, and the detailed accounts we have paint a picture quite different from those seeking to legitimize massive collateral killings. In the rare, detailed accounts we have, we read that the Prophet's Persian companion, Salman al-Farisi, who conveniently pops up to offer military advice, suggested the use of a mangonel to breach the walls of the fortress of the bellicose Thaqif tribe. Accordingly, the Muslims constructed a mangonel, but they never actually put it to use, as the individuals who were attempting to operate it were killed when the forces of Thaqif attacked them with hot iron and arrows. The Muslim army subsequently continued to lay siege to the fortress without the use of mangonels, and the Thaqif eventually surrendered. Thus, according to this account, the Muslims only tried to use a mangonel once in a brief unsuccessful attempt to breach walls that were guarded by combatants. This is very different from how it's presented in the ISIS article. The ISIS author seems to be unaware of such details. Another invoked precedent comes from a hadith recorded by Bukhari and Muslim, 2 famous hadith collectors, in which the Prophet is queried as to whether it would be permissible to attack an enemy force at night when it's dark, and he responds in the affirmative, indicating that any non-combatants harmed collaterally are of the combatants. We can call this the "they are of them" hadith. With this in mind, the ISIS author goes even further and asserts the best practice when conducting raids is to start during the night or at the break of dawn before the sun rises when the enemy is asleep. At such a time, it is very likely to enter buildings where no light shines and an adult male is not easily distinguishable from women and children. The author attempts to buttress this claim that it is best to attack in the dark while the enemy is sleeping by pointing to the example of God. For the Quran states that God destroyed many towns at night or while people were sleeping in the afternoon. This represents a remarkable conflation of the human with the divine. As for the normative example of Muhammad, of the Prophet, the ISIS author makes no reference to and demonstrates no awareness of the well-known hadith recorded by al-Bukhari that indicates that the Prophet actually never started an attack at night. And for this reason, many scholars were suspicious of the other hadith. As such, the ISIS author can hardly be described as a literalist especially when one considers that one of the most widely accepted hadiths explicitly states that it is impermissible to kill women and children. And of course, there are other hadiths concerning non-combatant men. And by the way, the terminology combatant and non-combatant are not modern terms. There are similar terms in the hadith corpus itself, muqatila. Okay. As for bin Laden, I realize he is no longer alive and has been many years since 9/11. And yet, as we saw earlier, in the exchange between Fareed Zakaria and Sam Harris, the latter has continued to point to bin Laden as a model Muslim, and one whose interpretation is honest and straightforward. But consider some of the interpretive acrobatics bin Laden performed in his generally unsuccessful attempt to convince Muslim clerics and Islamists, including many who already held anti-American sentiments, that the killing of civilians on 9/11 could be justified. Recognizing the Prophet's explicit prohibition against the killing of non-combatants, most notably women and children, bin Laden argued that Al-Qaeda's tactics against the U.S. were necessary and served the common good, notwithstanding indications to the contrary. And although the 9/11 attacks were directed mostly at civilians, many busy at work, he asserted that he was not targeting innocents, but rather the symbol of a threatening enemy, and that collateral casualties were therefore acceptable, an assertion widely regarded as disingenuous. For good measure, however, he also attempted to make an obviously modern argument that American adult civilians could be treated as combatants because both the taxes they paid, as required by law, and the decisions made by their government officials, who are neither unanimously elected nor unanimously supported, helped shape U.S. foreign policy. And finally, notwithstanding his superficial claim that he was not targeting innocents, he endeavored to advance and defend an aberrant, expansive conception of retaliation in order to justify the intentional killing of American non-combatants. And I'd like to spend some time on this last point. In October 2001, bin Laden was interviewed by the well-known Al Jazeera reporter Taysir Allouni, an interview that was not aired until January 2002. In this conversation, which is said to be the most revealing exchange with bin Laden on record, bin Laden responded to the claim that the 9/11 hijackers had killed innocent people. He remarked, "It is very strange for Americans and other educated people to talk about the killing of innocent civilians. I mean, who said that our children and civilians are not innocents and that the shedding of their blood is permissible? Whenever we kill their civilians, the whole world yells at us from east to west, and America starts putting pressure on its allies and puppets. Who said that our blood isn't blood and that their blood is blood? What about the people that have been killed in our lands for decades?" He would go on to declare that his people killed the civilians among the disbelievers in response to their killing of Muslims. Here the interviewer Allouni interjected, "So you say that this is an eye for an eye. They kill our innocents, so we kill theirs." Bin Laden replied, "Yes, so we kill their innocents. This is valid both religiously and logically. But some of the people who talk about this issue," he's talking now about the clerics and Islamists who rejected 9/11, who condemned it. But some of the people who talk about this issue discuss it from a religious point of view. Allouni asked, "What is their proof?" Bin Laden answered, "They say that the killing of innocents is wrong and invalid. And for proof, they say that the Prophet forbade the killing of children and women. And that is true. It is valid and has been laid down by the Prophet in an authentic tradition." Allouni interjected again. "Wait, this is precisely what I'm talking about. This is exactly what I'm asking you about." Bin Laden replied, "But this forbidding of killing children and innocents is not set in stone, and there are other writings that uphold it." Bin Laden proceeded to quote the Quranic injunction, "If you believers respond to an attack, make your response proportionate." Surah 16, verse 126. This verse actually appears in a passage that, according to most of the well-known commentators of the Quran, actually encourages restraint. And I'd be happy to elaborate during Q&A if you're interested. In any case, bin Laden continued. The scholars and people of knowledge, among them Sahab al-Ikhtiyarat, Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn al-Qayyim, and al-Shawkani, and many others, and al-Qurtubi, may God bless him in his Quran commentary, say that if the disbelievers were to kill our children and women, then we should not feel ashamed to do the same to them, mainly to deter them from trying to kill our children and women again. Now, notice how bin Laden invoked these four scholars to justify his expansive conception of justifiable retribution. The reality, however, is that while various scholars legitimized, in cases of necessity or darura, collateral damage and the use of certain destructive methods in response to an enemy's use of such methods, they generally did not condone the intentional killing of innocents as a means of retaliation. In fact, the Quranic commentator bin Laden invoked and he praised to justify this practice, al-Qurtubi, the last name, explicitly rejected this in his exegetical writings. He stated that even if enemy forces killed our women and children and made us grieve on account of this, then it is still not permissible for us to kill them intentionally in a similar manner to cause them to grieve and be sad. This statement comes from Qurtubi's commentary on Surah 5, verse 8, which says, "Do not let hatred of others lead you away from justice, but adhere to justice, for that is closer to awareness of God." The available writings of the other scholars invoked by bin Laden reveal no obvious departure from al-Qurtubi on this matter. By the way, many people assume bin Laden was like some big Islamic studies scholar. Actually, no. In fact, we don't even have solid evidence he got his bachelor's degree. And what was his degree in? Was it civil engineering? Was it economics? Was it business? What was his degree in? You'll notice there's a lot of uncertainty about that. And even the leader of ISIS, everyone makes a big deal, oh, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he's got a PhD in Islamic studies. Do you know where he got his degrees from? And it was not the University of Michigan. Do you know where he got his degrees from? A university established by Saddam Hussein in 1989. So not one of the classic Islamic universities. And do you know what his graduate degrees were in? His master's and his PhD? Tajweed. What is Tajweed? Who can tell me what Tajweed is? Yes?
How you read the Quran.
How you pronounce the letters. So instead of saying فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ, you say فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ. It's just how you pronounce it. The form, not the content. I think that's interesting. Anyway, now, there's a lot more one could say about bin Laden's various ostensibly contradictory justifications for the 9/11 attacks. Suffice it to say that he was by no means a strict literalist. Of course, the same could be said about Muslims in general. And yet it is critical to recognize that the attempts of Al-Qaeda and ISIS to justify terrorism on Islamic grounds typically require the abandonment of both strict literalism and the historically prevailing interpretations of Islamic law. The interpretations of such radicals are hardly straightforward. They are their own thing. Yet we cannot simply leave it at that. We must ask, what motivated the 9/11 hijackers to kill thousands of civilians and themselves? How can we explain the various acts of self-sacrificial terrorism committed by ISIS members and others? Various prominent new atheist authors explain such phenomena by pointing to Islam, not idiosyncratic interpretations of the religion, but the core of the religion itself, and downplaying other factors. While the worldwide Muslim scholarly and clerical condemnations of Muslim terrorism show that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other violent radicals are on the fringes of the Jihad tradition, Harris, as I shall explain, places them firmly in the center. And Ayan Hirsi Ali suggests that such radicals are not, in fact, a lunatic fringe of extremists. As Richard Dawkins sees it, the matter is fairly simple. Suicide bombers do what they do because they really believe what they were taught in their religious schools, that duty to God exceeds all other priorities, and that martyrdom in his service will be rewarded in the gardens of paradise. Now, compare such assessments with the more incisive analysis offered by terrorism specialist Jessica Stern. Based on her research, Professor Stern finds that terrorists are typically motivated by multiple factors, and that terrorist movements often arise in reaction to an injustice, real or imagined, that they feel must be corrected. Terrorism, she adds, spreads in part through bad ideas. The most dangerous and seductive bad idea spreading around the globe today is a distorted and destructive interpretation of Islam, which asserts that killing innocents is a way to worship God. Part of the solution must come from within Islam and from Islamic scholars, who can refute this ideology with arguments based on theology and ethics. But bad ideas are only part of the problem. Terrorists prey on vulnerable populations, people who feel humiliated or victimized, or who find their identities by joining extremist movements. Professor Stern goes on to offer suggestions for how to strengthen vulnerable populations. Now, there can be little doubt that religious faith is indeed a critical motivating factor for many, not all, but many Muslim terrorists. But their religion is distinct in important ways from the broader and historical Islamic tradition. I can understand why, as a journalist, Graham Wood of The Atlantic would characterize ISIS members as being Islamic. They identify as such and they invoke Islamic tradition. What is problematic, however, is Wood's added emphasis, very Islamic. Now I'd like to close by returning to Sam Harris. And I have nothing personal against Sam Harris. I'm just analyzing his texts and his statements. Less than a month before his aforementioned interview with Fareed Zakaria, Harris had appeared on Real Time with Bill Maher. In the midst of a heated exchange with actor Ben Affleck on the subject of Islam, Harris, having stated that he was actually well educated on the topic, proclaimed, "We have to be able to criticize bad ideas, and Islam is the motherlode of bad ideas." He proceeded to claim that suicide bombers occupy the center of Muslim communities. He added, "We're misled to think that the fundamentalists are the fringe," to which host Bill Maher chimed in, "That's the key point." The Islam that Harris portrays in his writings does indeed appear to be a motherlode of bad ideas. But it is an Islam that the vast majority of Muslims, whether scholars or lay people, would likely not recognize a motherlode of bad analysis. It is even more extreme in some ways than bin Laden's Islam. This is because Harris draws a nearly straight line from the Islamic tradition to 9/11. He erroneously downplays the significance of non-religious factors when assessing the al-Qaeda leader, asserting that bin Laden's grievances were purely theological. Bin Laden's Islam, however, was not that simple. His views on jihad were formed through convoluted reasoning and guided by a warped perception of geopolitical reality. Notwithstanding their profound differences, the same is generally true for ISIS. As such, Zakaria missed the mark when he told Harris, "The problem is you and Osama bin Laden agree. After all, you're saying his interpretation of Islam is correct." In point of fact, Harris's interpretation of Islam is so aberrant, so extreme, that it cannot even be ascribed to the man behind 9/11. I told you it was a dark lecture. Thank you for listening. I can take them.
We're open for questions. Everyone in the back, you're welcome as well. Let's see how it goes. Comments, suggestions?
I answered all your questions?
Yeah. They're depressed.
Yeah.
I have a question. So I was interested about the ayah, here's the Ali part.
Yes.
I've read her first book and I also read her heretic book.
Yes.
The first one, she seems really like pessimistic about Islam because the way she was brought up. But then when she wrote the heretic, she kind of like making like some changes to what her thought is, especially after the 9/11. I was just like surprised, why would she do that? Especially that now she's, I mean like, is it because that she has lived in America for so long that she's kind of like changes her perception, or what is the dialogue here? I mean, you pointed out some, but for this specific person, I don't know.
That's a very good question. Yeah, and I do discuss Ayan Hirsi Ali. I have a chapter on her in my book. So yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, that in her earlier works, I believe it's an Infidel, she has a very negative, pessimistic view. In Nomad, it seems like she's encouraging Muslims to become Christian. And then you get to Heretic, and she's now talking about reforming Islam. And the reform she has is a very serious reform. I have to say I'm critical of the way she describes the reform. For instance, she says that there are 5 problems, if I recall correctly, and one of them is that Muslims believe in the semi-divine status of Muhammad. I mean, these are statements that are just factually, anyway. But in any case, so she's calling for reform, and I think what's going on there is, yeah, she is maybe a little bit more optimistic as you get to the later books. And Sam Harris, by the way, same thing. I mean, Sam Harris, he's writing a book with a Muslim named Majid Nawaz in 2015, where they're trying to discuss the possibilities for reform. So you could say that there's a little bit more optimism as we get into the later, like 2015, 2016, etc. But at the end of the day, though, when you look at what they're actually arguing, the same issues apply. I mean, they're basically saying that it's adherence to the letter of Scripture. This is the problem. I mean, Harris is saying the same thing in his 2015 book, essentially. So, yeah, I mean, there is a transformation there. They're more likely to work with Muslims, usually Muslims who are open to very serious reforms, we could say, or various extensive reforms. But still, the ideas that I'm critiquing, they still apply. Yeah. Yes.
So Muslims who are like well off, but still commit terror attacks.
Yes.
Because you said that like the people who are most likely to become jihadists are in humiliated and vulnerable communities.
Well, for me, the key issue is angst. I think that's the key issue is angst. It's not about how wealthy or poor, how educated or uneducated. I think there are a lot of factors that go into it, but I think angst is a big one. So you could have somebody who was well educated. I mean, some of the 9/11 hijackers were well educated. Some of the Sri Lanka bombers were well educated. But it's a combination of angst with an ideological dimension. And there is an ideological dimension. That's why I say, I'm not going to say that people who do suicide terrorism are not religious. I'm not going to say that. Some of them are, but many of them are religious. But what I'm saying is that their interpretation is idiosyncratic. It's not representative of the broader tradition, historical or in the present. So I guess, I think I cut you off actually. You were going to ask your question. Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Well, well, why would they go into jihadism if they don't? I mean, I guess I don't understand what you mean by angst. Like angst over what?
Explain angst.
Angst, yes. So there's a perceived injustice, and they feel that they want to take matters into their own hands to establish this justice. I think that's one way of putting it. While at the same time recognizing that terrorism is complicated. I mean, for me, the key thing is I want to just make sure that we establish that terrorism is not simply I read a verse in the Quran and I go out and I get the bomb strap on and it's a complicated process. And as for the way it plays out, I mean, here I would defer to terrorism specialists like Jessica Stern and others. But in any case, yeah. Yeah.
But how do you, okay, so you have your thesis that they misinterpret the scriptures, they don't. So, but how do you explain their misinterpretation? It's not a coincidental thing that they are doing. That has roots in other traditions.
So, first of all, I want to be very clear. In this context, I'm not claiming what is the correct interpretation. In this context. In this context, I'm simply saying they are departing from the prevailing interpretations and from the letter of Scripture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Why? Well, okay. If we look at suicide terrorism, we see, for instance, the scholars beginning to justify it in the early 1980s. And the first step is to justify what it seems to be suicide. And they say, well, it's not really suicide. This is a martyr giving up their life for the cause. So that's the first step. And in the early 1980s, you begin to have suicide attacks, mostly directed at soldiers and others. As you get into the 90s, you begin to have suicide attacks directed at civilians. And you can actually see an evolution in how the justifications are made. So it begins with, okay, these people, they're not really innocent. For example, you have a prominent cleric named Yusuf al-Qaradawi who will justify suicide terrorism in Israel. And I think this was actually really destructive, because I think this opened the door, opened the floodgates for suicide terrorism in the 90s. And the justification is, oh, well, all Israelis have to serve in the military, and they're on our land. This is, of course, very sloppy logic. First of all, not every Israeli has to serve in the military, and even if they did, they're not now. And even if we accept all the assumptions, there's still problems there. But in any case, it's a slippery slope, and so you begin to get more justifications. Well, if it's okay for the Israelis, then it's okay to kill these people too, because they're threatening us. And then it expands and expands and expands. And the key point, the point I want to stress is that this is very much a modern phenomenon. And this is the point Bernard Lewis makes as well. That this is something that doesn't have antecedents in especially Sunni and 12-year Shi'i Islamic thought. So you asked about there were antecedents. Could you give me an example of what you had in mind?
No, I'm asking
Yeah.
why these people took this interpretation. They could have done something else. They could have said, look, this is an offshoot of Islam that is not really characteristic of the scriptures, but they didn't do it. They took the other way.
So bin Laden, when justifying 9/11, he says, I got the idea to attack the Twin Towers when I saw towers in Beirut being attacked in 1982. And I saw innocent women and children being killed. And I thought, how come nobody's defending them? And he goes on to say that the idea of what we did on 9/11, or what Muslims did on 9/11, he doesn't say we did it until 2004, at least not publicly and explicitly. He says that this is something that's according to religion and logic. He says it's not even about like religion, it's also about logic. He says if we were not blessed with Islam, if we were still, as he puts it, pagans, we would do the same thing. We would do the same thing. Because America, he goes through this laundry list of things that he sees America as doing, as threatening Muslims. He says, they have sanctions in Iraq that led to the death of 1 million children. Those are his figures. But we know many children were killed from the sanctions. Now, who's to blame for that? That's a separate discussion. He says that the U.S. occupied our land, and they support the oppression of Palestinians. So even Bosnia. I mean, everything that America does, he views it in a negative light.
Yes, but these people, I'm talking about the Christian, I'm talking about these people who condemn Islam.
Yes.
Why did they condemn Islam? Why didn't they say this is a group of people who are
Whites and Harris.
Oh, I'm with you on that. Yeah, I'm with you. I mean,
No,
yeah.
not with you. Why did they take this track to condemn the whole religion?
The whole religion. Because, okay, it's hard for me to say with certainty. I'd have to be a psychologist, but I would guess, I would hazard.
Yes, it is psychology.
Yes. I'm unfortunately a religious studies scholar, but I will hazard a guess. I just think that that's the interpretation, that's how they're seeing it. They see these violent passages in the Quran, and they're seeing it with a particular translation, and presented in a particular way, and they assume that this must be what 9/11 is. So, for example, Harris, he cites 60 Quranic passages in the End of Faith. I mean, it's like you go through page after page, from the 2nd to the 6th surah, of passages condemning those who reject faith. And he takes it, he says, look, this is what you will see on 9/11. So it's a kind of, that's what they're doing. They're seeing verses in the Quran that condemn. Now granted, it's usually God condemning those who reject faith in the afterlife, but he's reading it, he's expanding it to include, so that his reading is that the Muslim reads this and thinks, okay, I should hate the non-Muslim. Never mind the fact that Muslim scholars always made a distinction between non-Muslims in general and those who are kuffar condemned in the Quran. This is what I showed in my first book, actually. That you have someone like Al-Ghazali saying most of humanity is going to heaven, But still, he would use, he would say that there are, he would distinguish between Muslims and non-Muslims in this life. But as for the afterlife, he would say that there are many non-Muslims who would go to heaven. So I guess I would just say it's a kind of one-dimensional reading of Scripture that's taken then to confirm what happened on 9/11. It's a good question.
Building on that, now that I understood how you were asking the question, it's interesting that they're atheists, and they identify as atheists, because it would be consistent if they would do that same thing with all religion and say, this is Christianity, it supports this. Let's look at the white supremacists who quote the Bible. Okay, so this tells us what Christianity is. If they do that with all religions, then there's a certain kind of hatred of religion as the cause of all evil in the world, which is a typical atheist position. Do they do that, or do they particularly pick out Islam?
I think a good number of them are critical of all religions. Yeah. But I would say that certainly with someone like Harris and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, with those two individuals especially, Islam gets special attention. And I think 9/11 is sort of the major reason. Yeah. Yes.
So my question is, can religion really explain these things? Why is it always the beginning point? Why not find answers in other disciplines, like in sociology? Is it, because I feel that the limitation is religious studies probably, because all of you start from there.
Yeah.
And
well, I don't think it makes sense to begin with religious studies, personally. I think, here's something to keep in mind too, is that, if you look in Muslim majority countries, religion is part of the atmosphere. It's part of, there's a joke in Egypt, which is where my family is from, that even the thief, before the thief steals, says, Bismillah, in the name of God, and then they steal. Religion is part of the culture, it's part of the life. So, I personally would say that when we're looking at terrorism, it doesn't make much sense to me to begin with religion. Religion has to be part of the discussion, but I don't think it makes sense to begin there. Actually, with bin Laden, you can actually trace out, you can actually see how he becomes radicalized, and you can see the role of politics and how he becomes radicalized. But again, for me, the key thing is let's avoid simplistic assessments. Let's not say it's not religious at all. No, religion is there. It's not the interpretation of the majority, but it's there. Let's not say that it's just it's just religion, or that it's primarily religion. No, there are other things involved as well. So I just want nuance. That's all I want. Yeah. Yes.
So in terms of polling data, in terms of polling data, does it support your thesis? Do a majority of Muslims in Muslim majority countries condemn terrorism?
Yeah, very good question. So actually I discussed that in the book because Harris will show these polls that are really disturbing. For example, do you favor suicide bombing? They'll ask, in Lebanon was a really high percentage after 9/11. So what's interesting is that the polling data it changes dramatically from year to year. So actually in Lebanon today, if you ask the same question, what do you think about suicide bombing? It went from a high percentage to actually now a small minority. And then when you look at other polls that ask, is it okay to kill civilians in warfare? Sometimes actually you can find Muslim majority countries that perform better than here in the United States. So here in the United States, people might be more likely to say it's okay to kill innocent civilians in combat as compared to other various Muslim majority countries. So the polling data, I would just say it's not black or white, it's gray. Obviously, I would like for it to be better, but it's not. I think people use polling data in kind of a sloppy way, and they don't look at the whole picture. Yeah. Yes.
When countries like Lebanon have a high percentage of yes, suicide bombing is okay, have you noticed anything preceding that could cause that, or is there any correlation with other things going on?
Yeah, there's probably, so basically this is going to be tied into the Israeli conflict, and there's going to be part of this part of the propaganda that this is how we fight Israel. This is the only way we can fight Israel, and you'll even see this romanticized in films even. Where the Israelis are oppressing, and so this is the one way to defend yourself, and so it's romanticized, and it's there, and so I think that's why you see these high percentages in places like Lebanon, at least a few years ago. But then as you look at the data now, it's different, and especially as you have more clerics coming out and condemning suicide terrorism. I think you're beginning to see that those numbers drop. I hope they continue to drop, but that's where we're at. Yes.
In addition to that, like I understand like Islamic scholars or theologians in America or in Europe are able freely like saying no to martyrdom. But how about Islamic theologians and scholars in the Middle East? Would they want to appear un-Islamic that way? I mean, like they.
Well, here's the thing. To reject the idea of martyrdom would be a problem for many Muslims. The problem. Here's the issue then. Why not instead question whether suicide terrorism is martyrdom? Like, on what basis did we say killing innocent people is a way to become a martyr? And I think that's the more effective route. Because martyrdom is something that's celebrated. I mean, even if you're not fighting at all, the first martyr in Islamic history is a woman named Sumayya who was killed just for being a Muslim, right? So the idea of being a martyr, it's definitely recognized and glorified. The question is, who is a martyr? Why is somebody killing an innocent person a martyr?
Well, now
When I was
let's take those last two and then we're done.
When I was in Egypt, I was watching Egyptian television, and an imam was speaking and advocating martyrdom for women. He said women should sacrifice their life, suicide bomber, for martyrdom. Martyrdom was the highest way to go. So a woman caller called in and asked, but what will happen with my son? If I give up my life, what's going to happen to the child that I was raised? And the imam answered, Islam will raise the child. What is your response to that?
I mean, this is part of the propaganda. This is the propaganda that's encouraging suicide missions. It's saying that you're doing it for the cause. And I think that, I would like to think that we're beginning to see more people speaking out against this. I would like to think that. And judging by the kind of high-profile statements that have been issued against suicide terrorism in recent years, I'd like to think we're moving in that direction. But it is a disturbing phenomenon, no denying that. No denying that.
What do you say too about like the conflation between martyrdom and then suicide being haram?
Yeah, this is another discussion, right? Is because suicide is prohibited generally speaking in Islamic law. So what they're doing is they're saying this is not suicide. This is you're giving your life up for the cause. It's like the movie Armageddon or Independence Day. You're giving your life up for the cause. I'll be honest. I think it's easier just to focus on the killing of civilians when trying to condemn suicide terrorism. I think that's a much easier argument. The suicide thing, I can see how they're trying to. I just think it's easier just focus on the innocent civilians part. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time. And a couple of questions afterwards if you have some.
And if I didn't answer your questions, let me know, and I'm happy to talk some more.
Oh, well, now, written down now.
What that clicking sound is over there.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's probably the heat or something. No, I'm fine. Hi, so how are you?
Last night I love the show.
Oh, how is that? I haven't seen it
Everyone's
yet.
talking about it.
So what Ram does is also shows that conversation, and it was so
Interesting. I gotta check the show out. How do you watch the show? Okay, I gotta. Yeah, I have. Just recently. Everyone's talking about it. No.
So all of that so far,
It's all about the sex. Yeah.
that's fascinating, but then this brand is like, whoa.
Oh my God.
And it's how much
Okay, nice.
So it was ironic to check my email because it's a topic.
Yeah. Well, if he was depressed, imagine how I am. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. My pleasure. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Sounds like the book sort of plays well, like, every time I see this little book, but this, but that, it's like, I want to put it all together.
Yeah, well, that's why I felt like that's why I did the book, because I felt like I wanted us to do it all at one time. It was depressing though. Man, it was depressing. I'm already ready about like food or something.
Exactly. Well, we're gonna get you at lunch.
Hello.
Hi, my name is Rachel Foster. Yeah, so I am an alum of the University of Illinois. Yeah, but I'm very interested in your talk because
He's trying to talk to me.
master's degree in psychology, and I am and it's kind of on a related topic. And so I didn't ask ahead of time, but I did record your lecture. Are you sure?
Are you posting it for yourself or?
Just for myself.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I was nervous about posting. No, that's fine.
No,
Oh, you're fine. You're fine.
That's what I thought I might,
I took your hands on.
sharing it with the person who would be my.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Well, see, this is nice about it. It's like, oh, you're kind of, I mean,
I'm assuming it's yourself in the book, but he's asking me to kind of find my topic. He was my advisor for my master's program. No. Okay, yeah, it's gonna be, it's an online. So that may be really challenging.
But PhD in general is a lonely endeavor. So, regardless of where you are, yeah.
Because somebody said, yeah, we're gonna be studying more colleges or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think living in so many years, I live here in Madison, and I interact a lot, I provide hospital internet. I moved here right after graduating. So, yeah. And
Vanessa asked me to grab this and the laptop that was in there, just so you guys know. I think she's gonna stop by later today.
Okay, sounds good.
Get up. I feel like I should turn this off. I also don't want to erase it.
So like, I wanted to just get this before I start pursuing anything. Wait, he wants to have dinner over there? No, he wants to like host like a reception at the art gallery, like Sandy and I.
So he saw this, he was so inspired by our newsletter that he just decided to do this?
Yeah.
Is he gonna try?
Try what?
I have no idea, but, I mean, that seems like a weird, that doesn't seem like his wheelhouse of, no, because he's always like, yeah. That is so weird. Is that not weird? Super weird. So that's, yes, what I wanted to do. Can we even do a body thing now? The university services, I'm sure. If we're allowed to be doing something, so that's like, it seems like so much work for what, you know? What do you think? You want to tell us not possible?
Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Good thing to me.
Good. Thank you for
But then I don't have to
introducing
follow them.
Did you guys connect?
I haven't yet. I was out traveling in Minnesota for the weekend, so I haven't really been.
Survived it?
You know, I survived. Yeah, it was good though.
Did you go by road?
Did I what?
Did you go by road or you?
Yeah. Oh yeah. By road. Yeah, and there was like no snow any place that I went.
There was no.
None. Zero. No rain even. So we had like very easy conditions back and forth. We didn't get whatever grossness you guys got here.
I was in Rockford.
Oh, they got hit harder.
West.
Yeah.
It was really bad.
That's where John's from. Yeah, no, his grandparents I know got like a couple inches. And Yeah, no, North it was totally fine. So, yeah, yeah.
Right. And then there's one in time. So they're getting involved for that reason, but there's no private programmatic.
How is your end of semester going?
Fine. I mean, now that everything's over, it's sort of,
Are you working on the proposal yet?
I've already done it,
Oh, you done it?
Yeah.
You defended it already?
And that's even,
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
so I'm good.
That was good.
Yeah,
You did it together with the prelim?
I did it before. I did it in November.
Okay.
That
was smart.
Yeah, it's great to get that out of the way. I actually had written my proposal, the majority of it for a couple classes,
Okay.
a couple years prior, and so really I actually edited it very little in order, I like kind of updated some things, but it was nice that I didn't have to,
Yeah, better. Some people take like a year between the proposals.
just to do it, I know. Yeah, I feel lucky that it was Jane Collins who had us have it done for her class. And she had had us do several drafts before we submitted it to her for class. And then, I similar, Myra from sociology, I did like the second part, like the more theoretical part for her class that same year. So between the two of them, I was in like really good shape.